introducing Axios senior media reporter Sara Fischer.
I'm glad that Charlie Baker got you warmed up on the topic of sports, because we have a heavy hitter in the women's sports industry who is joining us next. Michele Kang is the majority owner of the Washington Spirit. That is the home base of Axios. And she's here to talk to us today about investing in women's sports. Michele, come on out.
Wow.
Big stage, right? Michele, you made your name in business doing something that has nothing to do with sports, healthcare, technology. Why is this a passion point that you're now investing in?
I have no idea. This happened, my life has been very well planned, very well thought through and so forth, but never ever in my entire professional or personal career that I was going to get into sports, let alone women's sports. But the opportunity presented itself, and I absolutely saw the possibility. I'm an entrepreneur at heart, and I saw the opportunity, the gap between where it was a couple of years ago and where I thought it could go was absolutely huge. And I was actually very surprised that there has not been a level of investment that either the Silicon Valley, all this money sitting around, hasn't really discovered. So just like what I did in the entrepreneurial world, in the IT business, healthcare IT, I jumped in when everyone was very skeptical, and I just jumped in with head first, I guess.
Yeah, you came in at a very good time. 2024 was a breakout year for women's sports, including in soccer. The National Women's Soccer League signed a landmark, I think, 4-year deal worth $240 million with a bunch of media companies. U.S. women's soccer has never seen that kind of media distribution rights.
Correct.
But I wanted to ask you about the structure of them, because they are distributed across so many different platforms, CBS and Amazon and Scripps and ESPN. There could be an argument that that's actually hard for the women's sports fan to find their programming on all of these different channels. Do you think we're risking their attention for the sake of revenue?
Yeah, I think you can say there are pros and cons. It's definitely challenging to keep track, but at the same time also it's not a bad thing, because people just don't watch only one channel or one streaming platform. So being able to have some sort of a games on multiple channels, I think it's not a bad thing. But it is also a reflection of where we are as an industry. We have pretty hefty competition, not just from other women's sports, but other mainstream sports. So there's only 24 hours a day, and there are only a few hours of the sort of the prime time. So we are competing against those time zones. So as we get more competitive and bring our more fans, we're absolutely positive that we'll get to more prime spots, and then the mainstream media companies will get in. But I have to tell you that women's sports, especially women's soccer, this is several years ago, there was a study done about women's sports, and one of the findings was actually women's soccer, women's sports fans are most internet savvy, because their games are not available on mainstream television, so they had to be very resourceful to find the games to watch. So as a result, they're actually very internet savvy. It's a good thing and bad thing. But so it is really a very competitive market, but we're getting there. Just relatively speaking, between 1.5 million a year only a year ago, and now we're talking about 60 million a year. So that's a huge progress, but we have ways to go.
Yes, and I'm glad that you brought up the digitally savvy women's sports consumer, because the audience is definitely there, and it's a strong audience for advertisers, young, in the demo, digitally savvy, but the sponsorship gap between women's soccer and men's is extraordinary. $24 million a year for women's, $600 for men. Why do you think that gap persists, and what are we supposed to be doing to close it?
Yeah, I think that is one of the things that I saw, and I decided that the gap between where it was and where it could go is huge. Sponsorship is one of them, media is another. And Also, all those things need the increased attendance and viewership and so forth. So that means that we as owners and the leagues have to invest in our product. So we're not just competing against men's product. If we just say to you, we're women, you need to support women, you may come to one game and ask for free tickets, not even paying, but we want you to come 13 weekends and 20 weekends in a row. So there has to be a compelling reason why you want to come, because you have only 7 evenings a week, and you want to go see Taylor Swift concert, you want to go have dinner with your friends, you want to go see a movie. So what's the compelling reason that you should come? And I think we have to find that value proposition and bring more fans. So I think the corporate sponsorship still, corporations are still somewhat stereotyping female sports. And it's my understanding that actually some of the models are always looking backwards. How many people came to your stadium? How many people watched on television? For just like a Silicon Valley startup companies, when you start, you can't look back. It's the future and how many people we're going to get. If you look at the numbers right now, even NWSL, the viewership actually doubled just year over year. The attendance, the game day attendance went up by 50% year over year. Washington Spirit alone, when I took over 2.5 years ago, it was like somewhere around 4,000 or 5,000. We're now 15,000. We tripled. So we're actually proving to our corporate sponsors that this is an incredible market, and actually there are proportionally more female fans for women's sports. And who makes household decisions? It's primarily women, right? So we are the prime target. We need to do a better job to explain what our value propositions are, and I think they will come, and they are coming.
At Axios, we have a partnership with a company called Deep Blue, where we do a series called TN50 about the business of women's sports. And one of the consistent themes that we saw over the course of this year is that the kinds of brands that show up for women's sports are very dedicated.
Yes.
But there are certain categories who are leaning in, financial services being a great example, and there are other categories that are really not. I would love to get your thoughts on which types of advertisers you think need to be stepping up more and which ones have shown a lot of support from a category perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are still a lot of corporations who feel that women's sports need to be supported. It's one of their corporate objectives and so forth. But I think they are waking up to the fact that the consumers, the fans of women's sports are the decision makers, because the biggest sort of a segment, if you will, it's a sort of a family with young children, and there is actually, as I said, higher percentage of female fans. So they're beginning to discover this. So I don't know whether there's necessarily one particular segment, but I think that there are a lot of actually consumer product companies that rely on sort of a women's decision making power. I think it's financial or the consumer product, beauty products. I don't understand why all this, even luxury products, they all go for the biggest tennis stars and all that. I don't know why they're not coming to women's games. So I think there's a lot more to be done, and I think it is happening.
You acquired the London City Lionesses last year, so you now have ownership of a women's team in Europe. What have you learned from how women's sports are managed there versus here, and what can they learn from us?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, the women's soccer has been kind of under-resourced and deprived of the attention and resources. It's changing. Clearly, I think that U.S. has led the way. Because we have more than half of our NWSL women's teams are independent, not affiliated with men's team. In Europe, the majority, I don't know what the right number is, but I dare to say over 90% of women's teams are all part of men's team. And they all got started because they felt that they should have women's teams, but they have not been investing as much as they have been investing in women's football. But I actually spun off the Olympique Lyonnais women's team, which is the first in Europe. And of course, a lot of people thought it was crazy and so forth. But now actually other teams are following because they recognize that there's a lot more to be had, and there's a lot of benefit for having dedicated women's teams. So they may not totally separate, but they're separating even inside the club. I think Chelsea is a great example, and they're doing that. So I think that that's going to be a trend, and I think U.S. clearly has set that trend. Now, there are some other structural things that I think Europe has done better than us, which is a lot of the youth academy development, a lot more systematic approach than pay-to-play in America. The development of some of the coaches. So there are certain things that we can learn from in terms of the development of the players and the coaches, but also the commercially, I think, there's a lot we can kind of compare and learn from each other.
I think one area where the world has looked to the U.S. in terms of leadership has been equal pay. Obviously, the U.S. women's national team putting out a lot of effort to move the needle there. But on the global stage, it's still abysmal. CNN, I think, did a study about the last FIFA World Cup in 2023 that said that women were being paid, I think it was about 25 cents to the dollar compared to men's soccer players. Why do you think that gap is so big?
Well, I mean, I think one thing that I want to tell everyone is that we do have to be patient, right? So Magic Johnson became our investor a couple of months ago, and we were chatting. And if you actually, when you look at NBA or NFL, you just think, oh my God, men's sports are so big and all that. When he got drafted into the Lakers, which I think is 1979, NBA final games were not even broadcasted live. It was tape delay, right? So they had several decades of experience and operations to get to be where they are. So women's football, by all account, in my opinion, has kind of gone through this incredibly explosive growth area in the last only 3-4 years. So I think we have a long way to go. In terms of equal pay, I mean, it has a lot to do with how many people are coming to watch our games and the corporate sponsorship, media dollars, I mean, all need to be there. But I tell my players that, quite frankly, especially in the US, women players should get paid more because our female players win gold medals and win World Cup. Men don't even qualify the World Cup. So to me, they should get paid more as opposed to equal pay. But I think there's a lot more work to be done in terms of making our product compelling so that more fans are coming and more corporations show up and more media dollars flow, and hopefully that will solve. And that's how I want to kind of solve that issue and use my business skills to develop fandom and corporate sponsorship and media dollars so that we can actually pay our players for what they deserve.
So right now you have ownership of 2 women's sports teams, the Washington Spirit and then the Lionesses in London. You've donated to women's rugby in the past. You're interested in other women's sports. Do you foresee yourself starting to get really invested in sports outside of soccer? And if so, which?
So, I mean, I think the rugby thing was, as I said the other day, it was the most expensive game I attended. But I think when I learned about the rugby during the Olympic, the situation of women's rugby team, where the rugby team is very similar to where women's soccer was 3-4 years ago. A lot of players are still part-time. They're doing literally bake sale to make their ends meet and so forth. So I wanted to give them little kind of a catalyst to get that going. But I think that I do have Leon. But to me, I don't think that, I'm not going to say no, never, but I don't think that I want to go into another sport yet because there's so much work to be done on the football side. But I think more important thing actually than buying another team is that I think that to move the women's sports to the next level, it's not just about buying the team and investing in training center and getting into the big stadium. The ecosystem has to come along with it. So, for example, we're talking about expansions. Right now, we have absolute shortage of coaching staff, performance staff, physios, you name it, right? And then even the players' development. So we can't just go expand. We need the coaching staff, the physio, performance staff, staffing development before we can even start expanding. There are also other things that are necessary, like media coverage, right? So things like Just Women's Sports that are coming out to cover only women's sports. So I want to invest in those kind of adjacency to move the entire sports along as opposed to just a team, because we need everything. We need investment in those ecosystem kind of areas. So one other example is the boots, right? The cleats, depending on which country you live in. It is one of the contributing factor for ACL injuries and injuries because I guess the official term is shrink it and pink it, right? Instead of using female feet as the mold, we use still many companies use basically men's shoes and make it smaller, narrower, and pink it. So I invested in a company that actually manufactures cleats and boots for women using female feet as mold. So all those things need to come along, not just a team. So that's where I will be focusing on, not necessarily just buying more teams or getting into different sports categories, but rather that ecosystem, and that's going to help bring the sports kind of advance.
That's spoken like a true entrepreneur, and I love what you said up the top, that you did not go into this investment necessarily because you were, a women sports fanatic, but because you thought it was a good investment, which I think is an important theme. Your attendance since you've taken over the Washington Spirit has moved from roughly 5,000 a game to 15,000. Viewership has doubled. When we talk about what matters the most, it's making investments in this whole ecosystem, staffing, performance coaches, all of those things. Shrink it and pink it. I'd never heard about that, but we definitely need better equipment
I didn't coin that phrase.
It
was already there. Yeah.
I love that. And then lastly, when we were talking about what women can learn here from the folks over in Europe and what they can learn from us, super interesting that the NWSL has mostly independent teams that are not tied to men's teams compared to in Europe, where over 90% of the women's clubs are tied to men's club. Everyone, please give a round of applause to Michele Kang, owner of the Washington Spirit. Thank you.
Okay. All right, thank you.